Welcome to the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. Today on the podcast it's just me. This is a solo episode, and on this particular episode I want to offer some reflections on the FOSS4G 2025 conference in Auckland. So just a few things to note that'll help give you some context before we get into these reflections. I could not attend all of the talks, so I am relying heavily on a data dump of all of the abstracts and talk descriptions to help me understand some of the overarching topics and patterns. And secondly, when I attend a conference, my goal is to do things that I can only really do at that conference. So I know that the talks for FOSS4G are going to be recorded and made available online. So what that meant for me is that if I was talking to someone in the hallway, I prioritize that over going to the next talk, because that is the experience I cannot recreate or experience online. So in terms of my reflections, I've tried to divide the conference up into some sort of bigger topics, some overarching categories. And the first one I want to talk about is processing and analysis. So there were a lot of talks that were in some way, shape or form related to the idea of extracting meaning and knowledge from geospatial data. So there was a lot of talk about AI and machine learning techniques, Python-based workflows, data pipelines, and automations at scale. And if you look at this and squint just a little bit, it kind of ties in with a bigger theme here, which, at least for me, was that FOSS4G is infrastructure, and a lot of times critical infrastructure. And I think the focus on processing and analysis really speaks to that. So AI was a big topic. This will surprise no one. It took up a lot of space at the conference this year, so there was a lot of the usual suspects. But the thing that I want to focus on in terms of AI were 3 talks. And the first one was AI-assisted coding and how this might change the way we develop geospatial software. I think considering how big an impact AI has had on coding, I was surprised not to see more of these kinds of talks at FOSS4G. There was a talk about AI in QGIS, which discussed how AI, large language models, can enhance geospatial workflows. Unfortunately, I didn't get to attend this particular talk. I'm really looking forward to watching it on when it becomes available online. And then there was a talk about free and open source AI assisted mapping, and this was given by the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. I have recorded a podcast about this and I'll be releasing that later on. Absolutely fascinating, the work that they're doing. And for me, I was really pleased to see these topics being discussed. Mostly when I hear people talking about AI and geo, it's in reference to big data, Earth observation data, image analysis. And I think the 3 talks that I just mentioned before touch a larger audience and will definitely have a near-term impact on all of us. In terms of AI, I also wonder when we'll get to the point where not every title of every new thing will include AI. The same way we don't talk about digital maps, we just talk about maps, and the assumption is that those maps are digital. Perhaps in the meantime, adding AI to the title of everything is like adding a health warning. Caution, a machine did this. So as you might expect at a conference like FOSS4G, Python was everywhere. And if you are in doubt, Python still feels very much like the default geospatial language. I did hear some people talking about Rust, which was really interesting. One person even went as far as saying that if QGIS was rewritten in Rust, it would be easier to attract new developers. And this made me wonder if Rust is becoming the new shiny thing in terms of geospatial programming languages. But I know very little about this topic. So if you know more about it, please reach out. I would love to learn. Visualization was a huge topic. And although there were presentations on cartography, the kind of visualization I'm talking about here is how information reaches end users. And there was a focus on web maps and rendering larger and larger data volumes in the browser. So it's pretty clear for most of us that we are far beyond static maps and into interactive maps. But when I look back on this focus on visualization and think about some of the talks that were given, I think we're moving into a world of interactive experiences where maybe we can just drop the map bit and start thinking about web apps, web maps as interactive experiences. And also on the topic of visualization, I was surprised to see quite a few talks on discrete global grid systems. The most interesting for me personally was a talk by Felix Palmer about A5, and yes, there will be a podcast episode about this soon. So every time geospatial people get together, I think data infrastructure and formats is always a big topic, and this was no exception at this year's FOSS4G. When I talk about infrastructure, I'm talking about how data is stored, organized, and accessed, the plumbing behind that enables everything that we do. And here, clearly, cloud native was the big winner. It got all of the attention. So in terms of cloud native formats, there was a lot of focus on COGS, cloud optimized geotiffs, ZAR, multi-dimensional arrays, GeoParquet, and PM tiles. So whenever I think about these formats, I don't think about files on disk, I think about objects in storage. I don't think about downloading and then processing, I think about streaming subsets of data. And there was one particular talk, it's called Is ZAR the New COG, which was awesome. It was really well delivered and incredibly interesting. And for me, one of the key points was, don't just take the default format, choose a format that best suits the use case. And after listening to the talk, it was pretty clear to me that the use case the speaker was referring to is not writing the file, it's reading the file. Who is going to read the file? How are they going to read it? And what are they going to use the data for? Think about that first and then optimize your file format for that. So that was file formats. The other bit was data infrastructure. And here, Stack, the spatial temporal asset catalog, stole the show. And I also thought DuckDB was mentioned quite a lot. So I don't know much about DuckDB. So if you do and think it would think we could record an interesting podcast episode about it, please reach out. I'd love to hear from you. Another big topic was standards, making systems work together, interoperability. And here I think the focus was mostly on OGC APIs replacing legacy APIs like WMS and WFS. And it's very difficult to talk about OGC APIs without mentioning PyGeo API. So my main takeaway from standards is pretty much always the same. They're pretty boring. Standards are, in fact, really boring. But that doesn't mean they are not incredibly important. And if you want interoperability and to reap the benefits of network effects, you need standards. So being FOSS4G, there was a huge focus on community. And there was lots of stories about community-led projects. Geospatial in the wild, solving real-world problems through community action. So lots of these stories seem to be driven by climate change, data gaps, the need for empowerment to decide what goes on the map, and basically people trying to create more resilient communities. So there's a real focus in a move away from expert-driven to community-led with expert support. And lots of these projects used OSM as the foundation. And for many of them, OSM is critical data infrastructure. So if I had to summarize this incredibly quickly, I would say, if you think about learning a programming language, a coding language, learn Python. That being said, AI coding is, in my mind, changing everything, and it's improving constantly, and it's well worth thinking about what this means for you in the future. Start thinking about maps as experiences. I think story maps are a really good example of this, and I think natural language interfaces are going to offer a totally new dimension to this in terms of the experiences that we can create for people. Embrace the cloud. I don't think that local processing is in any way dead or dying, but it is definitely worth understanding cloud native architecture and cloud native formats. Standards matter. AI is real. It's not future tech anymore. It's in production. It's here. It's now. And we're going to see a lot more of it. And increasingly, I think it's going to be a useful interface to geospatial data and analysis. And after listening to a lot of the stories about community engagement, it's pretty clear that large chunks of the map are still empty and we need locals to help fill it in. So overall, I thought it was an absolutely brilliant conference, fantastically well planned. The catering was amazing. The community was awesome. You just felt welcomed. It was really nice. I was also really pleased to see how much effort people had put into the talks. The effort that went into making some very technically difficult subjects to understand interesting and entertaining. And all of that starts with the title. It was fantastic to see human readable titles that provoke curiosity. We need to provoke that curiosity in people to help get them to understand something new. And I say that because some conferences I've been to, that the titles were all read like they were academic papers. And sure, if that's the audience you're speaking to, great. So, the conference was brilliant. I loved it. If I can, I will be back next year. But there were some things missing. And I don't mean this as a critique in any way, shape or form. But I was missing a focus on sustainable business models and funding models. I had one really interesting conversation with a gentleman about funding models for open source, and he insisted that organizations should change, that they should rethink their funding models. And maybe he was right, maybe they should. But another approach would be that we change, that we rethink our funding models. Perhaps we could talk about our current business models, how we make money, what we've tried, what worked, where we failed. And if we agree that FOSS4G is critical infrastructure, why not talk more about how to maintain it? If it really is critical infrastructure, the generous thing to do would be to make sure that it is there in the future. And if we could do that without the maintainers feeling like their time and effort is an arbitrage opportunity, well, that would be amazing. And on a similar note, personally, I would like to have seen more stories about side hustles and niche SaaS products that people had built and were building. And I was delighted to see a product workshop called Build the Thing product workshop on the schedule. That was fantastic. I wish I could have attended that. Another thing that I thought was missing or perhaps underrepresented was natural language as an interface. I mentioned a few talks that sort of referenced this earlier, but considering the impact I think it's having on the geospatial world, the way we interact with maps and geodata, I think it's be worth spending some more time on this. I am seeing so many companies, organizations implement this that I really think it's worth us talking about it more. And I simply can't imagine a world where natural language is not going to be one of the dominant ways we interact with the digital world. So I would have liked to have seen more discussion around this. That being said, it's relatively new, and perhaps next year we'll see that. So I mentioned before this idea of FOSS4G as infrastructure, and there was lots of people building infrastructure at the conference this year, and I was really surprised at how few people were making art. And I'm not just talking about cartography. So there was a talk about producing 3D models with the help of QGIS and Blender and 3D printing them. There were a few talks that focused on design and cartography, which is definitely art. And I guess, I know that the definition of art is very vague. I guess what I'm thinking about are passion projects that are not necessarily designed from the ground up to be part of anything bigger or to be built on top of. Projects where you have the feeling that the whole point of building it was simply to be creative. Now, I realize if you are an employee and trying to get funding, permission to attend a conference like FOSS4G, it's a lot easier if your boss looks at the schedule and she sees a bunch of work-related topics. I completely understand that. And I'm not dunking on those topics at all. They were fascinating. I just think if there was a few more creative projects represented at FOSS4G, it wouldn't only be fascinating, it would be inspiring. So again, please don't make the mistake of thinking that any of this is a critique of the amazing work put in by all the volunteers that made this fantastic event possible, because it's not. These are merely my reflections after having thoroughly enjoyed yet another amazing FOSS4G conference. During some downtime at the conference, I managed to convince some people to record a podcast episode with me, and I'll be publishing these slowly over the next few weeks. So thanks very much for listening to my reflections. Thanks very much for listening all the way to the end. I'll be back again soon. I hope that you will join me then.